I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm really only here to get a book by Kevin Chavis. No, I really do have Kevin Chavis to thank. I was actually the attorney for the City Council's Education Committee when he was the chair of the Council's Education Committee, so he hired me. Without him, I wouldn't have been elected to City Council and to mayor, so. Am I thanking you? And one more thing, as a matter of pointing out things, I'm really not the 6th mayor of Washington, D.C. I'm the 5th mayor, but I'm called the 6th because Marion Barry served twice. So I'll start out with a little bit about myself. So I'm a native Washingtonian, but I lost my election because I was not in touch with longtime residents. I'm a black man with white ancestors. At 35, I was elected as the youngest mayor in the country, and the youngest ever in DC. Not the youngest ever to be elected in the country, but almost certainly the youngest ever to have lost an election at 39. I was the first person ever to win 142 out of 142 precincts, but in my re-election, the populace was split clearly and cleanly along racial lines. I was the 3rd mayor in the country to endorse President Obama, but was not supported in my re-election by the White House. I was not seen as having done enough for black residents, but I risked my entire career trying to improve education outcomes for minorities. My mom was a shop steward in the Washington, D.C. Teachers Union, the same union that worked to spend $1 million to defeat me. And the last introductory fact, on election day, I had a 65% job approval rating, but I got 46% of the vote. I tell people there's no better job than being mayor of the city you're born and raised in. It's the best job I'll ever have. During the 4 years I was mayor, we presided over the International Monetary Fund meetings, World Bank meetings. The first day I was in office I actually presided over the funeral of former President Gerald Ford. I built a baseball stadium they actually voted against. I met the Pope. Welcomed the Queen, the Dalai Lama, French President Sarkozy, every ambassador, governor, and mayor in the entire world. I tell people that I'm the only person, I think, in the entire world who both played basketball with President Obama and rode a mountain bike with President Bush. And the cherry on top, in January 21st, 2009, after President Obama had given his inaugural speech, he goes into the Capitol, it's televised to the world on CNN and everywhere else. He makes a speech, and he begins his speech by saying, I want to thank Mayor Adrian Fenty and the residents of Washington, D.C. for putting on what at that point was the largest event in the history of the world, 2 million people on the National Mall, without one incident of crime or anything negative. And I tell people that it was at that point that probably should have resigned and gone out on top. But people ask me all the time, especially right after I lost the election, well, you know, what was the thing that you're most proud of? And I've never hesitated. All those other great things I did, I always say what we did for the schools. It's you know, the biggest issue that faces our communities. It's the issue that will interrupt the cycle of poverty. It's the issue that, unbelievably, mayors focus on crime and drugs, and we focus on housing, and we focus on jobs. But if we just got this right, it would take care of everything else. In D.C., as has been noted, when Kevin and I were in charge, the schools were the worst in the country, which is saying a lot. Just a couple stats. When I took office, 43% of 8th graders graduated high school. I think less than 10% actually would go on to college and graduate from college. We had 6 superintendents in 10 years, and 8% of the 8th graders in the entire city were on grade level in math. That means 92% of the kids who had gotten to the 8th grade in our public school system were behind in math. Some of course, as you know, were way behind. 12% of the city's 8th graders were proficient in reading. We had, if you can believe this number, 20,000 plus backlog of work orders for fixing the schools. When someone tells you that 20,000 backlog of work orders, that basically means that they have an infinite number of backlog of work orders. Basically, work is just not being done. Our enrollment had declined for 40 years, and it wasn't just the averages. There was one school, Anacostia High School, which is right in the middle of our lowest income community, that had a 24% graduation rate. 21% of its students were on grade level in reading. And so this was the fact year after year, and as I tell people, it wasn't that people didn't know about it, because they did. What was amazing is that there was never any action. But there were studies. And when I took office, we did a study. It was when the Parthenon group put it together for us. It's some 50 some odd pages, as you would expect. This is it. But only one page is even interesting at all to me. And it's called, What is the Need for Reform? And Kevin will appreciate this. Because what it showed is that we have been doing studies on what needed to be done in our school system since 1989, when a group called COPE put together a report called Our Children, Our Future. In 1995, when COPE put together another report that said, Our Children Are Still Waiting. And then in 2001, the DCPS Business Plan for Strategic Reform, and then in 2005, Restoring Excellence to DCPS. You get the point. All of these reports had the exact same conclusions. They all knew exactly what needed to be done, and there was one conclusion at the end of this report that I had started to focus on, and that was that someone had to be held accountable. When I got elected, I went to meet with Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor Daley, who were the two mayors who had taken over school systems. And it's really what they drilled into me. They said, I remember Bloomberg and Joel Klein particularly saying, you can't have 9 people in charge of a school system. One person has to be held accountable. And so I was sworn in on January 2nd, 2007. I literally took office at 12:01. I guess I report to work around 8:30. 8:45 I go down to the press room, and the first thing I did as mayor of the District of Columbia is I introduced this. And it was called the District of Columbia Public Education Reform Amendment Act of 2007. If passed, it would have made me the 3rd mayor in the country to have complete control over an urban school system. There's a lot of stuff in this bill too. This is what happens in politics. There's another 48-pager. But the number one thing that was important to me about this is I told my deputy mayor, everywhere it says Board of Education, cross it out and put mayor. Because to me, someone had to say, schools are broken, I'll be held accountable. And as Kevin knows, this has been tried in other cities and other places. We were lucky to be at the right place at the right time and show the right amount of urgency on it. Convinced the city council to pass it. June 12, 2007, take over the system. And just like in the private sector, I wanted to hire someone who was the best for the job, someone who was courageous, intelligent, someone from outside the system but who had know-how, someone who had a plan, who was unafraid, and who realized that if we were going to run the nation's capital school system, if we could actually fix it, then this really was a chance of a lifetime. And as you know, I hired, as she likes to say, a 37-year-old Korean-American woman who had never headed a school system, As Michelle likes to say, she was the worst pick on the face of the earth. But in reality, the changes that we made were unprecedented. And she is now known as the poster child for school reform. But again, we didn't do anything that wasn't already talked about, at least since 1989. What were those things? Fire the central administration. 1,000 people working in central administration. So we cut that to half, made everybody else at will. We turned the school system over to a properties expert, let him fix all those 20,000 plus backlog issues. We're off and running. We closed warehouses. We negotiated tough collective bargaining agreement, one now that is a standard for the country. It's the one that Newark has used in their education reform. And we did things like closing schools. And yeah, I've heard people talk about like closing schools who are kind of in the opposition to reform. But from a business perspective, let me just explain what we did when we closed schools. So, well, first of all, people had always talked about closing schools. Superintendent Janet, who was Michelle's predecessor, once tried to close 9 schools. After the opposition came, he ended up closing 0 of the schools because there's too much political backlash. So for context, our proposal was to close 23 schools, all right, and to close them all within 1 year. But in DC, in the wealthy neighborhood, everyone's been to DC, so you know where National Cathedral is, west of Rock Creek Park, there were 8 elementary schools, okay? In one of our really high percentage African American neighborhoods, Ward 5, there was 23 elementary schools. The wards have the exact same population. What had happened over the years is schools had closed in the wealthier neighborhoods, which had led to the schools having really high population. Schools in Ward 3 would have like 400, 500, 600 kids. And over here in Ward 5, you still had 23 schools, and kids in elementary schools would literally have 100, 150 kids. And so just as in business, you know, if you can take all your resources and concentrate them, well, then you're going to have arts and language and music and secondary teachers in the classroom. Over here in Ward 5, where you had 23 schools, where politicians had always pandered to the community and been afraid to close schools or do what was politically popular, you had all these resources spread around and no resources in the classroom. And so that was the backdrop for us proposing to close all these schools. And that is what we, in fact, did. And again, this is the thesis and the thrust of the charter schools, is to have independently operated schools that are nimble and have all the resources that kids need. It's also the thrust of private enterprise, of Silicon Valley, where I do a lot of work. You want to have resources and management right on top of it. But again, we made the choices despite the pushback. In the beginning, people were excited because we didn't even have to change the test scores in the beginning to have real concrete results to show people. Remember, before we took office, schools always opened late. Kids never got their immunization shots. Teachers, in fact, never even got paid on time. Textbooks were never there on time. And I talked about the backlog. Within 1 year of us taking over the school system, we turned all those around. Immunization shots happened on time. Teachers were not getting their paycheck. And within 2 years, our test scores were going up. Our graduation rates went up for 3 straight years. Dropout rates went down for 3 straight years. We led the country in increase in NAEP scores in reading and math for 4th and 8th graders. And of course, this is an objective test, at least if you compare amongst jurisdictions. We got $75 million from the Obama administration in Race to the Top dollars. And for the first time in 40 years, in 2009, enrollment in the Washington, D.C. school system went up. And I always think in business terms, the #1 indicator of whether you're doing well is whether you're getting more customers. And a jurisdiction that was once the butt of jokes was now being chronicled by Time and Newsweek and Jimler and U.S. News and World Report, 60 Minutes, Wall Street Journal, of course, the great documentary Waiting for Superman. But despite all of this, in September of 2010, I lost the election, and lost it ugly. This was a really divisive election. As I said, 4 wards for me, 4 for my opponent, split right down the line along racial demographics. The funny thing is, in 2006, when I was first running, I told people that I was going to shake things up, that it was time for a change, and that I was going to hold people accountable. I tell people now, well, maybe they didn't think I would actually do it. And I wasn't sad because I felt like we had done everything the right way, but the people around me were devastated. My cabinet in particular, who includes people like Dan Tangerlini, our GSA director for the country now, Gabe Klein, who now runs Chicago's transportation department, and Michelle Rhee and others, we're really making some great strides for the city. And so I had to, call a cabinet meeting and bring everybody together and really try to analyze, what had happened and to put it into context. And I've always been a big fan of history, and I debated whether to talk about Churchill or FDR or RFK, JFK, even to talk about some of the leaders I thought in the education reform movement, like Joel, Mayor Bloomberg, and others. But I actually talked about, this cabinet meeting right after I lost the election, I talked about Martin Luther King and the speech he made the night before he was killed. Because it's a speech which is all about courage. And he got some amazing quotes in the speech. He talks about at one point, when people get caught up with that which is right and they are willing to sacrifice for it, there is no stopping point short of victory. He talks about only when it is dark can you see the stars. He talks about his own day where he had spent 2.5 hours on the runway as they re-inspected his plane because of bomb threats. He talked about being stabbed and the knife going so close to his heart that if he had sneezed, he would have died. And of course, he talked about the reason he was in Memphis itself was to support the sanitation workers, and he really called upon the people of Memphis. The question is not, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? He tells them, either we go up together, we go down together. So there's some great lines of courage in this speech, and I was talking to my cabinet about the loss of my election. But I told them that there was one line in this that I always paid attention to, and it kind of drove me in my 10 years in elected office. It's not the line where he says, that we will all go up the mountain, even though I may not get there with you. This is the line where people think that he kind of was predicting his own death the next day. But it's the line where he says, like anyone, I would like to live a long life, but longevity has its place. Because I always thought about that when I was making my decisions, because I knew that they were not popular. I always tell people, if I wanted to get reelected, I know exactly what I could have done. First, never take over the schools, do everything the union wanted, and everything my city council wanted, all the silly people they wanted me to hire and stuff like that. To do that, I got elected probably in a landslide. But we were making these decisions that were highly controversial, and I knew that there could be consequences. But I always knew that it wasn't really how long I stood in office, but what we got done while we were there. And that is what I told the cabinet that day. And I referenced the hiring of Michelle Rhee, and I'll start to wrap up there, because it's instructive. Because so when I finally got the authority to run the school system, I am not an education reform expert. I tell people I'm a politician reform expert. I was not one who you would have seen at these meetings prior to 2006. So I really didn't know anything about running a school system. But I knew as a CEO I had to hire somebody great. So Joel Klein, Michael Bloomberg, you convinced me to do this. You convinced me to take over the schools. I agree it's the right thing to do. But now you've got to help me hire somebody. So I remember hanging up the phone with Joel Klein. He said, okay, Mayor, I'll call you back in a couple of weeks. Which he did. So he called me back in a couple of weeks and he said, Mayor, I know who's on your short list for superintendent, which actually was a surprise because at the time I didn't even know who was on my short list for superintendent. And he says, I would recommend two of them to you. One, both will fix your school system. One is a safer bet. I still do a good job. The second is a woman who would come in, fix your school system faster than anybody, but really ruffle some feathers. You know, true to form, I said, I like how she sounds. You know, when can I meet her, right? So he sends down Michelle Reed, and she comes down from New York or Denver, wherever she was, running a new teacher project at the time. And I remember during discussion she says, typical Michelle, you don't want to hire me. And I'm like, okay, this is an interesting way to get a job. And I said, well, why not? Why don't I want to hire you? You seem to be really focused, not to pat anybody's back here, but she really seemed to mirror the people I knew in the charter school movement in Washington, D.C. And what I had always wanted, actually, while I'm on it, I always wanted someone, since we had 45,000 kids, my thought was that if we had someone who was like as good as the people who run the charter schools, if I put them in charge of 45,000 kids, well then all of a sudden we're not making change by 500 kids at a time, we're making change by 45,000 kids at a time. So anyway, she said, I said, well, why not? Why don't I want to hire you? She says, well, people like me make life very difficult for politicians like yourself. And she went on. She didn't stop there. She took her opportunity to bash politicians, which is fine. And I said to her, well, listen, literally, verbatim, as long as everything you do is in the best interest of the kids of Washington, D.C., you're going to have my support 100%. But that didn't sell her. She went back to Denver, New York. But we got her to come down a second time. And the second meeting, again, I'm telling her, she's bashing politicians. Fine, I don't care. And I'm saying, and then at one point she asked me, she says, how much are you willing to risk? And without even thinking, maybe I should have, I said everything. And of course, I actually don't regret that at all. It's the first time I've ever been able to predict the future. So I tell people this, not as an example of my own profile and courage, but as a following. So here's Michelle. You guys know her history. So she's running a new teacher project, which is, similar to Teach for America, much smaller, but very effective. And she's being offered the job to run the school system of Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. It's essentially a dream job. And she's telling me, both between the lines and otherwise, that I'm not going to take the job unless you are willing to sacrifice everything. And it reminds me of that speech. It reminds me of exactly what Dr. King said when he said to the people in Memphis, it's not about you, it's about supporting what is right. He said to that group, let us develop a dangerous unselfishness. And I'm a politician basher now. People ask me, what do I think about the unions? I say, the unions don't bother me at all, one way or another. Because if you have a union, what it's going to do is support the employees in the union. What bothers me is the politicians who empower the unions. What bothers me is the people who negotiate these collective bargaining agreements with the 2-year tenure and the LIFO and the senior. I mean, there's no organization in the world run like this. And what really bothers me, to be perfectly blunt, which is the one thing I'm known for, is the Democratic Party. And I'm a Democrat. Because the Democratic Party has the wrong position on education reform for the wrong reasons. Because the Democratic Party knows that the way to fix the school system is to make it run like every other organization that works. I mean, people have to be held accountable. That you promote people who do a good job. And we set up our systems otherwise. And I'm not going to change parties, but whether you like it or not, those to the right who do support really aggressive reform have the right position for the right reasons. And so what I tell people is, we have to have some change in that regard. We have to both be willing to, because we all know politicians, we all meet them. I know they must tell you the same thing they tell me. I've run into mayors who say, I can't do that, because then I would lose the election. My base wouldn't support that. I've even met a mayor who said before, I worked all my life to get to this position. Why would I risk it now? You know what I mean? Well, because that's exactly what you're elected to do. But I tell people, politicians are the ones who have the power, but we are the ones who give it to them. And to me, too often, all of us will run into a politician, will give us an excuse why they can't do something, and we'll let them get away with it. We certainly let them get away with it in conversation, but we also let them get away with it with our vote. And so if I could have any message as, Massachusetts is debating these really important laws about charter expansion, let's not let them get away with it. Again, I'm not asking them to do what Michelle Reed did, where she was going to turn down the job of a lifetime if I didn't show that I was willing to sacrifice everything for her. I'm certainly not asking them to do what Martin Luther King and others did, to literally put their life on the line. All we're asking them to do is to do exactly what they said when they took the oath of office. And that is to do what they know is best and what is right. And there couldn't be anything better or more right than getting a great education for all of our kids. Thank you very much.